Finding Mr. Bridges, the most fascinating man you've never heard of. Hopeless romantic, rock star preacher, leader of men, and parish priest.
This is Phil, and on the 30th of June 2018, I was ordained deacon at Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford. And straight after the ordination, I was outside the cathedral, and the diocesan communications team shoved a microphone under my mouth, and this is what I said.
After all the moving and going from college to new house and everything, to have 3 days to just be quiet and think about what was about to happen and be with other people that are going through the same change was just amazing. It's just what I needed to get ready for today.
I should probably explain what on earth I was talking about in that clip. You see, the modern process for getting ordained in the Church of England is that you go through discernment process that takes place in your home church. So I was living in Milton Keynes, then go through the discernment process. When I'd gone through the discernment process and decided that yes, I should be ordained, I was then sent to college. So I spent 3 years at Ridley Hall in Cambridge, getting a degree in theology, being ready to be ordained. And then at the end of that 3 years, I then moved to Reading, where I was ordained, and I served as a curate. So that's the process and all the moving that I mentioned in that clip. The other thing I should probably explain is that in the 3 days prior to the ordination, they take you away on a silent retreat. It's a retreat where all those that's to be ordained go, and we are silent. We don't really speak apart from at certain times. And it's about having the space to reflect and to pray into what you're about to sign up for. So 3 days of silence and quiet, and then they bus you into the centre of Oxford, and you walk into Christ Church Cathedral, which is full of a choir and the friends and families of everyone being ordained. And then just to make sure that you have complete sensory overload and shock, they push you down the aisle in formation just as the opening hymn kind of hits its crescendo. So you go from the silence and the quiet of a retreat into a cathedral at full volume. So I was ordained at Christ Church, Oxford in 2018. And actually, it turns out that Nathaniel Bridges, who we've been following through, was ordained at exactly the same cathedral. He was also ordained at Oxford's Cathedral. A few years before me, he was ordained on the 14th of June, 1778 himself. So Bridges and I were both ordained in the same building, but how we got to that building and how we got to St Nicholas Willoughby after that was very different. Bridges had been at Magdalen College, Oxford for 10 years, maybe a smidgen more actually, when he was ordained at Oxford Cathedral. And whereas I went straight on to go and be a curate in Reading, Bridges stayed at Magdalen College, Oxford, and actually didn't take on a kind of vicar role until 1783. And we know that he actually stayed as a fellow at Oxford until that resignation we mentioned in previous episodes in 1793. So he spent a big chunk, 20 plus years of his life at Magdalen College, Oxford as an academic. And that's what I want to think about in this episode, because it had a profound effect on him. It shaped his faith. It made his faith and his expression of his faith quite different to the mainstream of the time. And actually, it put him in a place where he was the leader of a group in Oxford whose faith and whose expression of faith was one that the college authorities weren't keen on and were actually looking to try and stamp out. Have a listen to this.
Nathaniel glanced over his shoulder. He was relatively confident that he would be fine, but there was still a smidgen of anxiety in the pit of his stomach as he walked up the street towards Mrs. Durbridge's. Nathaniel knew that 6 students at St. Edmund's had recently been expelled for going to this very house, but none of them had a demmership. He thought his more expensive academic robes would insulate him from that fate, but it was a theory he would rather not put to the test. As he paced the street, trying very hard to not look shifty in his stride, he felt a slight kinship with Polycarp and the early church fathers who faced execution for their faith. He knew there was no actual danger of being executed for this now weekly journey. But even so, the St. Edmund's 6 had shown the world that you risked your entire career and your long-term financial stability just by attending these meetings. You'd think, he mused, that this would put me off doing this, making it an irrational risk to take, but quite the reverse. I feel compelled to do it, and not doing it feels like the bigger risk. He reached the door and knocked once. The door opened immediately, and he stepped through the doorway without a backwards glance. Once inside, he felt warm. It was May, so it wasn't exactly cold outside, but the spirit of the place just felt cozy, in stark contrast to the rigid chill of the rest of the city.
Okay, so there's a large amount of artistic license here, but we can be pretty confident that Bridges was one of those students who took that walk to Mrs. Durbridge's house. But let's back up for a minute and get a bit of context. We're now in the late 1760s, early 1770s. So we're in a period of remarkable religious stability. 100 years ago, the Commonwealth ended that period under Oliver Cromwell, where there was no monarch and a very strict Puritan faith was enforced that outlawed Christmas and just fun generally. The Commonwealth had come off the back of the Civil War and the Reformation. The pendulum had been swinging between Catholicism and different flavours of Protestantism for a long time. So we're at a point where there's peace. People have got quite attached to peace. So there was a bit of a sense that religion generally goes best if people don't get too enthusiastic about it. So there was a deep suspicion of anyone who took religion too seriously. People that were too religious got called Methodists or enthusiasts or evangelicals, and none of those words were intended as a compliment. And Oxford in particular was in no mood to tolerate religious enthusiasts. In March 1768, 6 students were expelled from St. Edmund's College, Oxford, for the heinous crime of meeting up to pray and read the Bible. They'd been going to a house in Holywell Street, which belongs to a widow named Mrs. Durbridge, and they'd been meeting with other evangelicals, both from within the college and, shock horror, ordinary non-college people, even some working class people, and they were treating everyone there as equals. As I said, there was deep skepticism about people who take religion seriously. But there's also a big dose of classism in there as well. The 6 who were expelled were all commoners, i.e. they were people who hadn't gained entry to the college through patronage and through knowing the right person. They'd paid to get a place, and some of them were actually doing work in college to pay for their fees. So the college was fine with expelling them, although there was a little bit of a backlash. Anyway, so the St. Edmund's 6 were expelled a few months after Bridges arrived in Oxford as an undergraduate. Unlike those who'd been expelled, he had what they call a demyship, which means his board and his lodgings was paid by the college, and that's because he's well connected. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And I think because he was so connected, that made him safer in many ways because of that class element. But at the same time, because he was safer actually he had a lot more to lose if he was expelled. But whoever was expelled, it had some quite serious implications for them. Meant they didn't finish their degree. They might have actually spent a lot of money trying to get into college in the first place. And ultimately, the big kicker for many of them is that ultimately that expulsion was a block on them getting ordained and taking up parishes in the Church of England, which for many of them would have been the plan. Having said that, a number of those who were expelled actually gave up on the CV and became itinerant preachers, members of the early Methodist movement. But Bridges remained at Oxford. Henry Venn visited Oxford and reported finding 12 zealous students, and he identified Bridges as the senior member of this group. So Bridges was leading a group of evangelicals who are meeting in Oxford, despite the Oxford authorities trying very hard to stamp it out. Essentially, Bridges' group was an underground movement meeting together and avoiding the authorities. They actually were quite good at this, and their key mechanism for avoiding getting caught was meeting together for breakfast, because in the early mornings, most of the college was either in bed or hungover from the night before. So in Oxford, Bridges acquired an evangelical faith through those Bible studies at Mrs. Durbridge's and through rubbing shoulders with other enthusiasts and Methodists and evangelicals. And that left him with a really passionate and powerful faith, which I think unnerved people for some of the reasons that I outlined earlier about actually this taking faith seriously risked a return to that Protestant Catholic pendulum that was swinging for much of the last couple of 100 years. But I think there was another element at work that made people uncomfortable, is that it was just very different to Georgian society. We have a little insight into what Bridges was like and how his faith played out, because in 87, Benjamin Constant, who was sort of a French aristocrat, took his equivalent of a gap year in the UK, and he spent some time visiting Nathaniel Bridges, and he made a note in his diary of what it was like. And we're going to listen to a little snippet of that now.
I arrived at length at Waddenhoe, where I found everything prepared for my reception. Mr. Bridges was not at home, but returned the next day. He was an excellent man, almost fanatically devout, but utterly disposed in my favor. He was persuaded, although I never told him so, that I had come from Paris expressly to see him. He kept me with him for several days, introduced me to his neighbors, including Lady Charlotte Wentworth, and set me financially afloat. In response to all the kindnesses shown me by Mr. Bridges, I willingly accommodated myself to all his religious observances, although they were considerably different from mine. Every evening he assembled some young people of whose education he had taken charge, 2 or 3 servants of his household, farmhands, and stablemen. He read to them some passages from the Bible, and then made us all kneel whilst he uttered long and fervent prayers. Often he literally rolled on the ground, striking his forehead on the wooden floor and repeatedly beating his breast. The least distraction during these exercises, which often continued for more than an hour, would throw him into a real despair.
There's quite a lot to unpick there, isn't there? I suppose I'll start with the thing that immediately jumps out, and this kind of rolling around on the floor, banging his head against the floorboards as part of these hour-long intense prayer sessions. What's with that? Well, this behaviour feels to me a little bit like it's a bit of a precursor to what we might call Pentecostal or charismatic traditions, which didn't exist in the 18th century as they do today. That act of rolling around on the ground and beating his breast suggests a theology that demands total physical surrender to the Holy Spirit, valuing the emotional experience of faith over the restrained liturgy of the contemporary Church of England at that point, which was quite dry. So it might be that there's a kind of, I'm not going to be dry like the rest of the church because this matters. And when it's dry and quite academic and quite rigid, as we saw Samuel Parr tended to be, then maybe that lacks some authenticity and some meaning for Bridges, perhaps. The other interesting thing to note is that Bridges has taken Constant to meet Lady Charlotte Wentworth, who was actually quite a prominent figure. She was the sister of Charles Watson Wentworth, who was the Prime Minister. He was the Prime Minister twice, but his second term, which only lasted 14 weeks because he died, had ended only 5 years previously. So Bridges, we see, is connected to some quite prominent Whigs, and actually he's via the former PM's sister is connected right to the centre of government and political power, which is quite interesting, isn't it, to think about that actually he was sneaking around in Oxford, trying not to be seen by the proctors, going to Mrs. Durbridge's, but at the same time he's friends with the sister of the Prime Minister. And then finally, to draw your attention to the fact that all of his household was present. So all the servants and farmhands and whatever were in that room with him when he was having those intense prayer sessions. And on the one hand, this kind of leads back to what we were saying about those meetings at Mrs. Durbridge's, where one of the reasons the authorities were uncomfortable with them were that actually the dons and the fellows were rubbing shoulders with the non-college students and with even some of the working classes. So we see that attitude of valuing and caring for the working classes and the servants in his involvement of them in these prayer meetings. On the other hand, you could say, I'm not sure how much choice the servants had in whether they attended or not. So there might be an element of his status ensured their presence, whether they wanted it or not. But I think even so, it's a good indicator of the way that he viewed the working classes. And I think later on we'll see that actually he interacts much more comfortably with some of the working classes than he does with those of his own status. So I've been a little bit mean in this series. We started in episode 1 with Bridges proposing to Frances Young, but I didn't tell you what she said, and I've refused to tell you what she said for the last 2 episodes. I will tell you in the next episode. We'll find out what she made of the things that we've been discussing in episodes 2 and 3, and we'll find out what her answer is, and we'll find out what happens after that. So do join me next time.